Today we are flying from Ontario, California to San Jose, California, KONT-KSJC. I always start my flight planning at skyvector.com just to get a general idea of what the route's going to look like. Now this is about 290 miles as the crow flies, but as you know, it's not going to be a straight shot like that. So my next stop is Flight Aware because I want to see what actual airlines are flying today. Chances are this is going to be a Southwest flight. Go ahead and take a look at the route. And as you can see, it's not as the crow flies. The thing I'm most interested in is the route line down here. I'm going to go ahead and decode that. This shows all the waypoints between Ontario and San Jose, along with my Pomona 7 SID, my Silicon 1 star, and transition here at Makers. I'm probably going to be using the Avenal transition, which is another popular one. But this just gives me a general idea of what real airlines are flying, and as I program my FMGC to make sure that these waypoints are accurately represented in the flight plan. My next stop is over here to flightplan.com, and I've plugged in Ontario, and it gives me my stars, SIDs, and approaches. I'm interested in the SID, of course, the Pomona 7. So here's my Pomona 7 departure. Sorry that it's in portrait mode here, but I'm going to be taking off to the east, circling on around, and then eventually picking up the Pomona VOR, and then on out to Buck, Tubold, Gorman, Correz, and finally Avenal. Next I want to take a look at our approach into San Jose. So I'm going to be looking at the Silicon 1 star. So we'll be transitioning at Avenal and not Makers, and picking up at Silicon, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So this particular star has a southern route and a northern route, and this is the one we're going to be taking today because we're going to be landing at 12 right, so we'll be landing to the southeast, so we'll come on around into San Jose. So let's head over to the aircraft and program our FMGC. I've got power to the aircraft, so now I can program my FMGC. And I start by clicking init, and then I have to put in my airport of origin, Ontario, and I'm doing it manually. You can use the company route, but that's a different tutorial altogether, which has not been done yet. And we're going to San Jose, California. So enter that, and then I want to align my IRS, which basically aligns the aircraft's coordinates with GPS satellites. I'm going to ignore cost index and cruise altitude right now. If I enter them at this point, I will get an error, so I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to go right to the flight plan, and we'll start with our departure. We have winds from the southeast today, so we'll be taking off from runway 8 right. We're going to be using the Pomona 7 SID, and we will transition at Avenal. which is a VOR in Central California. And I'll go ahead and insert that into the computer. Next, our arrival into San Jose. We're going to be landing on runway 12 right. Again, winds from the southeast. And we're going to be using a new star called Silicon 1. It's got some clever little waypoint names, as you'll see in a minute. Nothing to click there. And I'm going to ignore the transition, TROX, which I'd like to put in, but I can't because there is a bug in JAR's A320 that really creates a mess, and I'll show you that in a minute. So I'll go ahead and insert it as it is. And let's just step through it and see what we have. And I'll be stepping through this using Air FMC on my iPad. So everything is pretty normal here as we leave the area. And our transition point is Avenal. And then finally we begin our approach at Silicon Valley. Interesting, we have Apple and Jobs. And this star takes us around to the northwest, and you can see how it takes us on into San Jose. Now the reason I didn't click TROX for a transition point in the star is because there is a bug in the JAR A320, and you'll get a really bizarre flight plan. It's quite random, and I'm just going to step you through it so you can see what I'm talking about. So here's Ontario, and all this is pretty regulation and what you would expect. But then we get to this bizarre checkpoint, and then we begin this kind of formation flying, or this fly around, which is completely random, makes absolutely no sense. But we end up back at the Silicon waypoint. We never get to TROX, but then everything is fine on into San Jose. I've zoomed in even more and shown some waypoints here because I'd like to smooth this out a little bit and come in at more of an angle to intercept the localizer. This star actually uses vectors. In other words, at some point ATC is going to vector me into this, but since I'm not relying on ATC, Pilot Edge, VATSIM, any of those others, I want to program in my own approach. So I've mapped out a couple of these additional waypoints here on Sky Vector, and you can see how from Zorsa I come over Raymond, Edoy, finally Artak, and on into San Jose. The only way that you can customize the approach in this particular aircraft is by deleting the waypoints it's put in. Not really the best way to do it, but it's a little bit buggy if you don't. So I'll go ahead and clear these. Down to the runway. Now I can go in and put in my other waypoints. Pull it up so I can see it. So Raymond, and then Edoy, Finally, my initial approach fix, RTAC. I normally work on my iPad to do all this. Makes it go a lot faster. Otherwise you're hunting around for those letters. And then sun. And finally, judge. And if we go up and take a look, we can see that we have a much better approach and attack angle on that localizer. Alright, now that our flight plan is in, let's finish programming our computer. Going back to the init screen, putting in a cost index of 20. You can use others, but I've just gotten in the habit of using 20. Seems to work out. Flight level today will be 300. Now I click the right arrow button, which takes me over to the fuel screen, and I simply select the default right buttons, and it fills in the amount of fuel that I put in previously. Then over to our performance screen, and I simply fill in the red rectangles by selecting the default. Our transition altitude is 5,000. I need to put in my flex number. This is the number that is used when the throttles are set for takeoff. I haven't quite figured it out, but sometimes this number is filled in depending on the sequence that I program the FMGC with. We'll set our flaps and trim to 2.0. And just step through the other screens. There's not a lot you can do on these actually. And then our approach screen will be filled in or completed once we begin our approach phase into San Jose. Then I always start my flight back on my flight plan screen, and that concludes the programming for our flight from Ontario to San Jose.